The higher self is a very popular term in the spirit of this age. So today I'm going to be explaining what the higher self is and its role in our evolution. The concept of a higher self has been known through every age, but it's gone by different titles and different wording. And also within each age, there's prominent ways of perceiving the spiritual. And so with that comes its own way of conveying these terms, but on top of that, of how they relate to the physical ego and the physical experience. So in this age, the term the higher self would be most related to what we know in mysticism as the Atma Buddhi. Now, the Atma Buddhi is a theosophical term that was given to us by Madame Blavatsky from Hinduism. When it got carried over into theosophy, however, there were some minor shifts, as you can imagine, with any terms, because our perception of them, we take in, and then a perception of a given concept evolves. And there's not really anything wrong with that so long as we're not projecting whatever we want to onto a concept. So with that, the Atma Buddhi, or what we call in this age, the higher self, is the first manifestation of a personality from the all, or from spirit. So that first manifestation of spirit would be what's considered the higher self, and even in some traditions, it would just be considered the oversoul. So sometimes in mysticism, the higher self and the oversoul are actually referring to the same thing. They're almost like interchangeable titles. And then sometimes it's not. Sometimes they're distinct differentiation between the oversoul and the higher self. If you'd like to know more about the oversoul, you can watch my video on it titled The Oversoul Explained. So I go all into the oversoul in that. But the higher self, being what we know in mysticism as Atma Buddhi, would be the vehicle. The higher self would be that first personality, that first vehicle, the vessel of spirit. And from the higher self, now we can incarnate from that first vehicle or that first personality into lower realms, into the physical realm, into an ego. So just like how our ego in this reality is our vehicle and our unique expression for our spirit, the higher self would also be a vehicle at a higher level, and it would also be its own personality of the all, of spirit. Every spiritual system throughout the ages have had their own way of conveying this term Atman, or Atma, or Atma Buddhi, or Manas, or Atma Buddhi Manas. But that's where the higher self has originated from. And so in the spirit of this age, what the higher self is actually best known as our future self. The higher self is the future self. And the future self can be looked at like a director, just like how there's directors of movies. The higher self plays the role of director to us. So the higher self is the director of our movies or our incarnations here in the third dimension. In fact, the higher self doesn't even need to be, that role doesn't even have a necessity until we get to the seventh dimension. In the seventh dimension, that's where all of a sudden you see the higher self or our future self start to manifest. And that's because at that range, at that frequency bandwidth of the seventh dimension, that's where we start having there be guidance that comes in a more practical form, if you could even call it that, but guidance so that in our lower third dimensional incarnations, there is some structure and intention behind each incarnation. Because the overarching themes that we learn within each lifetime, the overarching challenges that we have in each lifetime, have lessons within them that the higher self finds valuable, which is why it directs the soul, or us, our personality, to come into those lifetimes to experience those themes, because those lessons and those experiences that we have are what gets brought back. That's like data that gets brought back to the higher self for its own development. The higher self is the multiverse condensed into a consciousness that is on a journey of exploring the infinite nature of reality. It is the accumulation of all of the experiences, wisdom, and lessons that a soul complex has acquired thus far through its evolution. It has a vast resume spanning off-planet as well as both higher and lower dimensions. Our consciousness is divided into a trinity. Imagine a trinity of your soul, your higher self, and your spirit. All three of them are you. They are just focused in specific directions. The soul is you in this present moment on your journey. It's also known as the witness. But the higher self is the collective you. It is the collection of experiences in all lifetimes and in all dimensions. And your spirit is you as source, God consciousness, in the eternal now. They are all you. They are just in different phases. Another way to describe the higher self is as a representative of the entire cosmos that is then channeled and funneled into a unique aspect of the totality. Now, the reason why I describe the higher self as our future self is because, once again, there's no necessity for there being a higher self when we're higher up in dimensions. That only becomes a necessity, that only becomes a role when it's vital for us to have guidance, for us to be able to have a director in the lower realms. And so the higher self has a vital role within our entire spirit. But beyond the seventh dimension, when we go higher into higher realms, higher densities, whichever way you want to look at it, the higher self doesn't need to exist because there's nothing that needs to have something focused, something that has guidance and intention for lower dimensional experiences. That's why I call the higher self the future self, because the future self would still imply that there is a past, present, and future. And that concept of there being a past, present, and future does not actually exist after a certain point, once you get higher. So that's why the higher self is really our future self, because it's still within a structure or a dimension where time, in some way, is still relevant. Now, we usually equate the term personality with something that belongs strictly to the ego or to lower qualities and lower attributes. But personality is actually one of the main features of spirit. So much so that the very first religion that all religions really came from, which was animism, was described best as just the personality of all, the personality of spirit. That's what spirit is. in its highest expression. It's these intrinsic attributes of existence. And so spirit being linked with personality, it also comes from many different branches of mysticism. There's really not an issue with there being personality when it comes to the esoteric realm, because what we mean in the esoteric realm when we're talking about personality is completely different than what people are typically talking about when they're talking about personality. So personality is usually equated with the ego, and it's usually equated with us wearing some form of mask to hide who we truly are. We build this fake or false persona, and that would be the false self, which is known as the personality. That's valid, but in the esoteric realm, we consider personality to just be attributes that are unique to different parts of existence. And so personality, having a vehicle, having some form of structure in order for it to create and to experience, is what the higher self truly is. Because once again, it doesn't even come into the picture until we reach a certain point where now all of a sudden we can start accessing lower experiences. So we need the higher self because the higher self is a vehicle to carry personality. And that's why higher selves all have some sort of unique way of conveying themselves, or they look different from one another. It's because the higher self is the personality of spirit. With it being the personification of all that is, you can imagine how multifaceted the higher self actually is. If the higher self is one thing at all, it is personification. And if there is one characteristic every higher self has, it would be creativity. High levels of creativity, because the higher self is both the creator and creation. So the higher self is creative when it communicates to us and when it connects with us, because it knows how we will best receive it through our own personal affinities. So the higher self is spirit's vehicle of expression, and that's going to look different. And that's why when we have these experiences here in the physical third dimension, we are like ambassadors of something far larger than ourselves. Because how can you get something as large as the higher self spirit into something as small as one individual ego, one individual consciousness unit? You can't fit it all. The higher self's expression is way far wider than that. So that's why it's beautiful in a certain way that all of us are just like ambassadors at best of something undescribable and far larger than we could even fit all into one physical unit. Even in esoteric Christianity, the term the personalities of spirit was extremely important to be able to convey that there are larger extensions of who we are here, and that our thoughts and our being feeds them in a positive way, in a way where it's inspirational. And so this higher self concept is best known as being the director of our movies here, the one that comes in and has the intention set for each lifetime. Does that mean that we have no free will? No, it doesn't. It just means that there's intention set so that we experience certain themes, and then we extract the free will lessons that are gained from those, and those get fed back to our higher personality. So the higher self sometimes is known within the spirit of this age also as our multidimensional being. So sometimes in the New Age, you'll hear people say, our multidimensional being. And we're like, how does that relate to anything that we know? Well, the multidimensional being is a far more accurate way of calling what we know as the higher self. So they're interchangeable terms. With every age, you're going to see different ways that we perceive things, and then there's going to be terms that are created from those perceptions. And that's not new, and that's not exclusive to this age or the new age. But multidimensional being might be just a little too woo for many people. Higher self, we're more comfortable with because we already know what a higher power is. So, the higher self gets brought into the scene at a higher level when time is still relevant and we're not completely out of time. That's why it's called the future self. And the future self, or the higher self, or the multidimensional self, comes and experiences lessons through its individuated soul streams, through its individuated souls. It's a multitasker at best. It's a master at being a multitasker. So it's not just one soul that's getting incarnated into one experience. The higher self can have many different soul streams come into many different experiences. And all of those fruitful lessons, all of those rich experiences is like data that gets fed back to the higher self and creates more of its development and creates more of its personality or essence. And so it's a positive feedback loop. We're at a certain point in our own evolution. Our goal here is to embody as much of our higher self's essence or personality as we possibly can. Well, our higher self is learning and invested and fascinated in all of the lessons and all of the knowledge that we have incurred within our lifetimes. And so it's a win-win. The higher self ends up becoming a more evolved essence, a more evolved multidimensional being. So a very common goal within the spiritual community is to embody our higher self. And what that would look like is broadening our own bandwidth, broadening our own consciousness, our body, mind, spirit complex, every layer, broadening its bandwidth so that we can receive more of our higher self's essence or personality or spirit. And by embodying more of our higher self's personality or spirit, we're able to become fuller. We're able to become more developed. That's how we evolve. Do you see that feedback loop between us and our future self, or us and our higher self? So the multidimensionality that the higher self holds, because it's not one-dimensional. It's such a multidimensional being. It's having experiences in this dimension and off-planet and in other dimensions, all at the same time. So it's multidimensional. And when we embody more of our higher self, what does that even mean? It means that not only do we become more conscious, but that we're able to access, to bring an anchor into this physical reality, flavors of consciousness that aren't typically experienced here. These flavors can be compared to a radio station. Each radio station plays one type of music and one type of frequency. This has locked our human consciousness into the belief that we are only a finite human being. But once a being starts to awaken, they develop a feedback loop with the higher self. This feedback loop is what we are calling the embodiment process. It is the connection with our future self. It is the conduit with our future self. that is sending us resources and bringing more radio stations or frequencies to us so that we can fully develop. This can look like psychic abilities coming online, finding life more humorous, increasing our intelligence, increasing our capacity to integrate knowledge, connecting with higher aspects of ourselves or spirit guides. Multidimensional being means that you've got a lot of different frequencies. You're not locked in to one specific version of reality that's creating one specific manifestation of reality. So here in this physical realm, we know the way that this world has been manifested, and then we take that for being all that we can access and all that exists. And that's why people think that they are so sure and know so much through their very limited and narrow belief systems that they were brought into and had been indoctrinated into, let alone. But when you access more radio stations, when you're accessing more frequencies, now you're anchoring in more versions of reality that carry a lot more information or spirit in the form of that frequency. So you're carrying in, you're anchoring in so much more information. That's what it's looked at by the time it gets into the physical body. By the time our multidimensional being or our higher self starts to become embodied in us, what that would look like is we're carrying more information or more frequency. And so that's not going to look specifically like how we would imagine it to look, because we were here on one radio station hearing about some cool concept, but not knowing that it exists like way over, like 20 radio stations over. So we're like, by the time we start actually embodying our higher self, we're going to start looking weird. Because the concept that we heard, that we imagined on one radio station, is going to start being brought into that physical form and brought into that radio station. But by the time it gets here, it's not going to be what we expected or what we thought, because we were on one radio station waiting for something that we could only comprehend through our limited bandwidth. In short, by the time we start embodying our higher self, it's gonna get weird. That's why you see people in the New Age doing light language. There's certain codes, certain frequencies are carried within different expressions. It's gonna look weird. It's gonna look odd when we're bringing in more frequency, more radio stations into one that's been in a frequency lock. We've been locked into just one radio station playing one style of music for a really long time, and we couldn't even imagine anymore that there were other things going on in reality and other extensions of consciousness. So the way that we embody our higher self is non-judgment, because as we expand our consciousness and as we evolve and grow, we're going to naturally start unlocking on its own different portions of our consciousness. And those different portions of our consciousness were not online, and they're going to come online, and it's going to look weird. So the higher self is going to be manifesting into physical form through us to the best of our ability. And the more we heal, the more we can embody our higher self. So that's why healing is a huge theme within the spirit of this age. And how we can best facilitate this process, how we can best embody our higher self, is through non-judgment of how that looks. Because as we grow and as we expand our consciousness, we're going to naturally start aligning our will with our higher self's will. And we're going to eventually start merging the lower self with the higher self. And that's the goal of integration. I hope if you call this episode word salad, you just didn't understand what was being said and you're too lazy to go back and rewind it. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for higher dimensional guidance through spiritual awakening. See you next time.